Madam President, since I first came to the Congress back in 1997 as a freshman member of the House of Representatives, I've been talking about spending and debt deficits, and that was a key central element of my campaign for my first election to the House of Representatives way back in the day. And of course, at that time, the numbers were a lot less daunting than they are today. If you look at just even where we were 15 years ago in relative terms, the point at which we find ourselves today is almost overwhelming. And the debt now is over $14 trillion. We're being asked to raise the debt ceiling even further. And I would argue, Madam President, that we can no longer afford to put these hard decisions off. Because these are serious times, and these call for serious solutions and serious leadership, and I hope that we are up to that task. For a long time, we thought that debts and spending and deficits and all those sorts of things could be acceptable up to a certain level, and I suppose to some degree that's true. Historically, if you look at our country in terms of revenue and spending, we have had consistently over time a certain amount of debt that we carry. But I think by any stretch, any American, any economist, anybody who watches this closely has to recognize that the situation in which we find ourselves today is really unprecedented in American history and cries out for action, and immediate action and bold action. And this is something I would argue that my constituents are very concerned about. I think all Americans are very concerned about because, again, if you look at it in relative terms, where we are today, $14 trillion in accumulated debt, and you go back in the annals of history and look at from the formation of this country back in the late 1700s until 1849, our federal government spent, if you can imagine this, only about $1 billion over that 60-year time period. And so today, we will borrow $4 billion between today at 9:50 and this time tomorrow at 9:50. Our federal government will borrow $4 billion, which, to put that into perspective, Madam President, suggests that we will borrow in the next 24 hours more than 4 times what we spent in our first 60 years as a nation. Now, in fact, in 1835, under President Andrew Jackson, the government debt for the only time in our nation's history was completely paid off. Since that time, our debts have been large and small, with large run-ups in the debt during times of war, while the debt largely declined during times of peace. Never, though, did our debts top even 50% of our entire economy, of our GDP, until the Great Depression. At the end of World War II, debt topped 120% of GDP. But in the post-war period, debt steadily declined as a percentage of our economy, attributable to a couple of factors. One was strong economic growth, and the second was a government that managed to keep spending relatively low. But when you look at the post-World War II time period and you get into the 1960s and you reach that end of the 60s, and that time period to 2008, from 1969 to 2008, government spending consumed on average about 20.6% of our entire economy, while taxes during that time period on average were about 18% of our economy. That imbalance led to a sizable but a manageable national debt. Debt held by the public just before this president took office was $6.3 trillion. Now, to put it into perspective, during the previous 40 years, the budget was balanced on 5 occasions. So if you look back in the last 40 years of our nation's history, there were 5 occasions on which we were able to balance the budget. In each of these years, and those were 1969, 1998, 1999, 2000, and 2001, spending was below the historical average. In 1969, spending was just 19.4% of our GDP. In 1998, it was 19.1% of our GDP. In 1999, it was 18.5% of GDP, and in 2000 and 2001, it was only 18.2% of our GDP. And so when we look at the years when our budget was balanced, Madam President, spending averaged just under 18.7% of GDP. So what are we set to spend this year? 24.3% of our GDP. An astonishing 30% more than we have spent historically when our budget was balanced. And our debt held by the public at the end of this year will be nearly double what it was when this president took office. So how do we get to such a high level of spending? Well, to be fair, Madam President, I think you would have to say that some of this is attributable to the economic downturn. Obviously, tax receipts, revenues are down as a consequence of the economy being in a recession. We also have the ongoing conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, which have been expensive and obviously have required a large commitment of resources in order to conduct the operations that are necessary for success there. But I would argue also, Madam President, that a substantial chunk is due to the spending spree that Congress has been on since 2008. Between 2008 and 2010, spending on non-defense discretionary programs went up more than 20%, even though inflation over that same time period was around 2%. When you add in what eventually the bailouts of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are going to cost, which will be hundreds of billions of dollars, that adds significantly to the debt. And of course, the stimulus boondoggle cost us over $800 billion in the short term, and when you add in the interest costs that are associated with that, it will be over $1 trillion, which was all borrowed money, borrowed from our children and grandchildren. And you look at the percentage, as I said before, of spending $1 trillion literally on that one program, that one policy, the stimulus program that went into effect a couple of years ago. That's literally 1,000 times more than what we spent as a nation in our first 60 years of its existence. And if we look at the projections included in the President's budget, it's revealing that it never balances. And that's due entirely, Madam President, to spending. Spending under the President's budget never falls below 23% of our entire economy, of our GDP. And after 2015, it grows, and there isn't a single year when the spending does not grow as a share of our economy. So you've got this constant growth in spending, overall spending as a percentage of our GDP that is way beyond the norm if you look at any sort of historical average. So when the President submitted his initial budget to the Congress, we were all hopeful, I think, that it would demonstrate an acknowledgement that he gets it, that he understands the dimensions of this problem and how serious our fiscal and financial straits are. But the budget that he submitted to Congress a few months ago actually increased spending over the 10-year time period, massively increased the debt, and raised taxes on our small businesses at a time when, as I said earlier, we're hoping to get the economy growing and expanding again, and that helps address many of the problems that I just mentioned. But you can't have economic growth when you're raising taxes on the job creators in our economy, which is our small businesses. And I would argue that the two things that are going to be necessary for us to get our economy back on track and to address this issue of spending and this out-of-control debt is to get spending under control, to make the hard decisions that have been put off for far too long, and secondly, to put policies in place that will enable and create the conditions for economic growth and job creation. Well, if you look at what the current administration is doing in terms of policies, what I hear in my state of South Dakota as I travel from small businesses, I hear it from agricultural producers, is that almost at every turn they are facing new regulations, new policies coming out of Washington that not reduce the cost of doing business, but actually increase the cost of doing business and drive down their margins, making it more difficult for them to invest capital, to hire new people, and to get this economy growing and expanding again. And there are numerous examples of that. You've got a number of agencies that are just promulgating regulations, pursuing an aggressive agenda, much of which can't be accomplished here in Congress because there are not the votes in the Congress to accomplish much of that agenda. And so the administration has decided by just sort of executive power grab to try and accomplish much of that agenda. Well, as I said before, most of those policies are things that make it more expensive to do business in this country, are going to make it more difficult for our small businesses to get back on track. I mentioned the tax increases the President has proposed, consistently proposed, not only in the budget that he released to the Congress several months ago, but more recently, a couple of weeks back, when he came out with his sort of new, improved budget, still loaded up with tax increases on small businesses, the very opposite of what you would want to to do if you want to encourage small businesses to invest and create jobs. And the economic uncertainty that's created by tax policies that are not permanent, that expire in a couple of years, the economic uncertainty created by not knowing what the next regulation coming out of Washington, D.C. is going to do to your bottom line is all creating an anxiety out there among investors in this country and keeping a lot of the capital that otherwise would be put to work and deployed in creating jobs on the sidelines. And so if you look at just a few, again, examples, the EPA is probably the most notable one, but that's the one I hear the most about. And it doesn't matter whether I'm talking to a small business group or whether I'm talking, again, to farmers and ranchers. Consistently they say these regulations coming out of Washington, D.C., and specifically in this case, most of them are referring to policies that are coming out of the EPA, are making it very, very difficult for us to create jobs, to put people back to work, and to invest and reinvest in our businesses. And so you have the types of regulations that are coming out of these agencies. You also have, as I said, run-up in costs associated with many of the policies that the Congress has enacted, the spending and debt issues that have been created by the stimulus bill, the new health care bill, which when it's fully implemented will cost $2.5 trillion or thereabouts, but is going to pass on lots of new costs to businesses across this country, not only in the form of tax increases, but also in the form of higher insurance rates, which they're going to be looking at. I think you're going to see just a continued period where businesses in this country, small businesses, because of this economic uncertainty, continue to sit it out and don't do the things that are necessary to get people back to work and to deal with both high unemployment and also the issue of a sort of depressed economic downturn that is going to make it more difficult for us to expand the economy and address this issue of increasing revenues at the federal level, which will help solve the problem that we have with the deficit and with our debt. Another issue that I would mention, which I think is significant right now in particular, but always is an issue for the people that I represent in South Dakota, is high energy costs. And the Democrat prescription, the most recent one at least, is to tax energy companies. It strikes me at least that if you want to get lower cost energy, one of the things that you would not do is raise taxes, make it again more costly, more expensive for people to do business. And if you look at, again, the EPA, the attempt to regulate greenhouse gas emissions under the Clean Air Act, which they really don't have the authority to do, but that we're moving forward with anyway, has made it much more difficult for energy companies to get permits, and a number of projects have been scratched across this country, and I can think of a couple in my state of South Dakota. But if you look at the fact that we can continue to get about 60% of our fuel from outside the United States, literally sending $1 billion a day to foreign countries because of our addiction to foreign energy, and you look at the policies here that we should be implementing if we were interested in getting to be energy independent and actually produce more American energy, again, you find a complete contradiction between what the President and many of his allies here in Congress say and the things that they do, because they all talk about energy independence. They all talk about getting away from this spending $1 billion a day on foreign oil. And yet the policies tell another story, because we are limiting even more the amount of area in this country that would be open to energy exploration and production. We have enormous resources here in the United States, oil and gas, clean coal, biofuels, all kinds of other things that we could gain access to. But right now we have energy policies, Madam President, that seem more intent on and concerned with some other agenda rather than energy independence. If you're really interested in energy independence, you would think that you would put policies in place that encourage the production of more American energy. And exactly the opposite is occurring. We've got more and more areas that are been taken off limits, public lands. We can't get to the outer continental shelf. We have a permatorium in existence in the Gulf. We've got areas like the North Slope of Alaska that have tremendous energy resources. Much of this is off limits to production in this country. And all that's going to do, Madam President, is continue to drive us into the arms of foreign countries, many of whom do not have the best interests of this country in mind, and perhaps even worse, fund organizations that plan attacks against the United States and our allies. And so it strikes me at least that if you're serious about getting deficits and debt under control, that one thing you would do is put policies in place that enable small businesses to do what they do best, and that is to grow and to create jobs. And secondly, you would put constraints on federal spending here in Washington, D.C., so that this issue that I mentioned earlier of consistent run-up in the amount that we spend on our federal government as a percentage of our GDP starts to not only taper off, but starts to come down. Now, there are a number of suggestions that have been made out there, and certainly perhaps no perfect one, but at least people are taking a legitimate shot at trying to address this issue. There's been a lot of discussion about the Ryan budget that was passed by the House of Representatives. And of course, that's already being immediately attacked, and so perhaps it isn't perfect, but it is a serious effort to control spending. Now, the only other suggestions that we've seen, as I mentioned, are some statements that have been made by the President about his proposals, again, all of which increase taxes, all of which increase spending, and all of which add massively to the federal debt. It just seems to me, Madam President, that we are not having a serious discussion about balancing our budget and paying off our debt, particularly, again, when you put into perspective where we are. Between now and 10 o'clock tomorrow, we will borrow another $4 billion, which, as I said before, I think it bears repeating, is literally 4 times the amount our entire country spent for the first 60 years of its existence. $4 billion between now and this time tomorrow is the amount that we will borrow. And we're being asked to raise the debt limit, the amount that we can borrow, essentially raise the limit on our credit card in the next few weeks, because we're up against that ceiling, we've hit the max, we've capped out our ability to borrow money, and we're going to be asked to make a vote to increase that borrowing authority. I don't think that can occur, honestly, Madam President, until such time as we are willing to put the steps in place, to take the steps that are necessary to get this issue of spending under control. This is by definition a spending issue. Now, a lot of people are going to argue, we got to have tax increases, we got to have additional revenue. But as you noted from the observations I just made about the times when we balanced the budget in the last 40 years, on those 5 occasions, in every case we were spending less than the average, and in some cases significantly less as a percentage of our GDP. Clearly, the way to attack this issue is to get spending under control, and that's going to require some hard decisions, many of which have been postponed. We've been kicking the can down the road for a long time, and what we've run into now is we're out of road. We've come up to the cliff. We can't kick the can down the road any further. The road is at an end, and we are up against some very serious impediments if we don't take the steps that are necessary to fix this problem. And I'll just mention again, when I talk about the seriousness of this, and over the last few years we've all paid lip service to this issue of deficits and spending and debt, but I always maintain that you have to judge people not by what they say but by what they do and how they vote. And we need to be on the record, we need to be debating this issue, and as we get into the discussion over raising the debt limit, it creates an opportunity for both sides, for Republicans and Democrats, to come together behind a plan that will meaningfully reduce spending in this country, that will deal with the issue of entitlement reform, which is something that's going to be desperately needed. We cannot solve this problem in the long term unless we address the issue of entitlement reform, and really get some limits on spending that will be binding, that we can't get around. It's too easy around here to waive things, to declare it an emergency, and to continue to spend like there's no tomorrow. But these are serious times, Madam President. They require serious leadership and serious solutions, and that point is probably no better made by the statements that have been made by some of our leaders in this country. As you all know, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen, has said in testimony before Congress that the greatest threat to America's national security is our national debt. I think that is a stunning and powerful statement about where we are and the importance of acting and acting now. You had former Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan say not too long ago that there is a 50% probability that we will face a debt crisis in the next 2 to 3 years. And then, of course, you had Standard & Poor's downgrade, or I shouldn't say downgrade, but provide a negative assessment to our credit rating in this country. And that too is something that we have not seen before. And I hope that if we're willing to take the steps that are necessary, that we can avoid our credit rating being downgraded. But typically what happens when you get a negative assessment like that, it's not too long that a downgrade in your credit rating follows. And so I would hope that based upon all those aren't just anecdotal things, those are fact-based assessments and analysis of where we are. These are people who know the importance of dealing with these issues. We continue to borrow more and more money from other places around the world, and we continue to put our future at greater and greater risk and in greater jeopardy for our children and grandchildren if we're not willing to take the hard steps that are necessary. And I will say, Madam President, this will not be easy. There will be obviously political consequence to any decisions that we make here, but these decisions are going to be particularly difficult because we have put them off for so long. But the easy decisions, the low-hanging fruit, it's no longer out there. We now have to decide, are we going to continue to spend and spend and spend and borrow and borrow and borrow to the point where we head over that cliff because we've run out of road to kick the can down, or are we going to make these hard decisions now and get serious about providing a stronger and a better and a more prosperous future for our children and grandchildren? We can't act like the federal government does not have a spending problem. Those days are gone. We no longer have that luxury, and the numbers bear that out. And so we need to look at the debt limit, the upcoming debt limit vote, as an opportunity for Republicans and Democrats to come together behind a plan that will meaningfully address our spending problem. The status quo is not acceptable. It is going to require leadership from the President, which so far, as I said, has been non-existent, and I hope that he will step forward. It's going to require leadership from Democrats here in the Senate. They control the agenda here. They have the majority. I hope that we do a budget this year. We didn't do a budget last year here in the Senate, and it's important that I think we have that debate. The American people see us debating how we're going to spend their tax dollars. That's something that I think every American should expect and deserve from their elected leaders, and I hope that we will have a budget markup in the near future here where we can get these issues out in front, not only of us for discussion, but also in front of the American people, because this is their future that we are talking about, and our failure to action, if we don't act, we are putting in great peril and great jeopardy the future for our children and grandchildren. And so, Madam President, I wanted to just point out a little bit about, I think, where we've come from, where, in my view, we need to go if we're going to solve this problem, and I hope that my colleagues will join in that discussion, not only just rhetorically, but that their actions will follow. Again, we can't just talk about this. It's time for us to quit talking and to start acting. Madam President, I yield the floor.